We have gone through these examples in the Old Testament of biblical appeals, and I brought up, I think, a couple of weeks ago, a consideration of this woman named Jezebel. Um, that is not a complimentary thing to call any woman. Don't ever call a Jezebel unless it is your decided intent to insult her. And if she's a millennial, she'll be so stupid she won't have any idea that it's an insult, because she is so ahistorical, so completely oblivious to historical reality. But to be a Jezebel and to refer to a woman as a Jezebel is not a good thing. And I do not consider Jezebel as a candidate for anything like a biblical appeal, like the women I have previously referred to in our study on Wednesday nights. And this is because the relationship between Jezebel and her husband, King Ahab of Israel. This is after the nation of Israel, after King Saul was succeeded by King David, was succeeded by King Solomon, and Solomon died, and his son became king, and there was a civil war, and the nation divided into the 10 northern tribes that were referred to as Israel, the dominant tribe being help me now, Ephraim, and the southern kingdom of Judah, the dominant tribe being the largest of the 12 tribes of Israel, Judah, with the small but feisty tribe of Benjamin. Well, the relationship between Jezebel and her husband, King Ahab of Israel, was very, very unlike any of those relationships that I've mentioned so far in our study. And just to refresh your memory, though we have focused on appeals being made by women, those appeals that we find in the Old Testament that are really worth study, and maybe when I make this into a book, I'll expand. We've got the situation of Joseph in Genesis chapter 39 appealing to Potiphar. We've got and the warden of the prison. We've got Ruth in Ruth chapter 2 in her dealings with Boaz. We've got Abigail in 1 Samuel 25 in her dealings with young warrior David. We've got Bathsheba in 1 Kings chapter 1 dealing with David in his advanced age while he's the king of Israel. We have Esther in Esther chapter 4. We have Daniel in Daniel chapter 1 dealing with the prince of the eunuchs, and we have Nehemiah in Nehemiah chapter 1 spilling over a little bit into Nehemiah chapter 2. Those are very worthy of our study and consideration. Though we studied in depth some of the appeals, for example, the appeal made by Ruth, by Abigail, by Bathsheba, and Esther, what we saw with those women would hold true if we were to examine the appeals made by the men that we have studied, or that we could have studied, which would be, of course, Joseph and Daniel and Nehemiah. The individuals each of those men appealed to were like the men the women appealed to, in that those men occupied unassailable positions of unquestioned authority that could not be challenged. People in the United States of America have a very difficult time relating to that. We can't imagine ourselves dealing with someone who occupies a position of unassailable authority that you absolutely do not mess with. You just do not mess with that person. It's because we're a culture very much in decline, and we have so little respect for authority. On Facebook the other day, there was something about mother, and it went on and on about mother this and mother you're this and she's that, and she's this and she's that, and you love her and blah 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 blah. And the only thing it never mentioned or made reference to was honoring her and obeying her. And those are the only two things that are important. Okay, in your relationship with your mother, has very little to do with the sentimental feelings you have for her, and has everything to do with the fact that God demands that you honor her and you obey her. And yet, our culture doesn't understand that. I remember, and I very much appreciated what Jackie did at the time. I remember years ago, one of our first camps down on Mount Palomar, that there was this mother who was getting some lip from her daughter. And she absolutely, you may remember the situation, you absolutely were not going to take any back talk from her. And she decided that she wanted to right here and right now. And she tried to bluff her way through, and Mom didn't stand for it, and I think she got smacked across the face. I know there was a situation in my own life that I've related to you a number of times where my mom said something, and I came back at her with some sass, and I got it across the face. I don't think we as a culture understand that anymore. The Bible talks about the fear of your mother, okay? How many of you were raised by a mom that you would be terrified to mess with her? I was. You don't mess with my mom, okay? My dad, I remember one time my brother got arrested. He was with two guys that were involved in a crime. He happened to be the guy in the car who stayed in the car while they went and did it. Anyway, he's going to be noble, he's going to be virtuous, he's going to take the fall with his friends. How stupid. How absolutely stupid. But anyway, he got arrested. And when my dad and I went to the county jail to pick him up from the jail, I'm looking at him like, fool. In the living room, my brother erupted in rage and shook his fist at my dad, saying, "Why don't you stop me from doing these things?" And what did my dad do? He did nothing. I think that was the beginning of the end of our culture. To have fathers who would have a kid shake his fist in their face and do nothing, okay? My grandfather, on the other hand, when my dad was 15 years old, he was 6'3". He was a big boy when he was 15. And he gave his father some sass, and my grandfather laid him out, and he said, "No kid of mine talks to me that way." So what did my dad do? He left home. He took off. My grandparents did not see their son for more than 5 years because my dad took off. Over the next more than a year, he rode the rails with his brother as a hobo. That was a very, very rough life. 1939, 1940, very rough life. Anybody have any idea what the SP police do to people when they catch them on their railroad cars? They crack them over the head with a stick. They don't say, "Please get off my choo-choo train." No, they just walk up and start whacking you. Okay? And then after he was called up for active duty, World War II, and my grandparents saw their son after the war was over. Now here's the interesting thing. My dad, not one time in his life did he ever have anything negative to say about his father. Now, don't get me wrong. I think that there is probably a better approach to dealing with your children than laying them out with a strong right hand. You know, I think the Board of Applications should be applied to the seat of knowledge, personally, okay? But we don't live in that kind of culture anymore where there is anything approaching respect for authority. We just don't have it. We just don't have it. And it is reflected in every area of life. I don't know if you have ever been in a situation where you have found yourself standing in front of somebody who had authority and you were paralyzed with fright. Anybody ever find yourself in a situation like that? None of you? Yes, Jackie? Would you... that you're willing to tell people about? Huh? Tell us, tell us. Can you hear her talk about ditching school?
I was ditching school one day and thought, well, okay, my dad should be at work by now. So I come strolling out of the house, and there he was in the front yard watering the lawn. So I read that.
Okay. Okay. Anybody else? Yes, Alex.
I was ditching in 10th grade, and my mom found someone who snitched on me. My mom had the police look for me, and when they found me, she was with one of them from killing me.
Okay. When my brother, yeah, Stephen, go ahead.
When we were leaving the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, the police at the scanner found they found my knife in my backpack.
Yeah.
And they took it away, of course, and then they had to ID me. So I wasn't sure if I was gonna give the police, stay, or what. But got bailed out by authorities.
And then the time that I went to Israel before that had Nelson Smith with me from the Baptist Tabernacle as a black man. Every single checkpoint, they stopped us. Because he might be a North African Muslim. He didn't mind. But wow, did it delay us, okay? Every single time. Like, okay, here we go. Anybody else? My brother, when he was 7 years old, just to show you the kind of dad we had. I mean, he kind of lost it when my brother reached his teenage years. But my brother, when he was 7 years old, chucked a big rock through a gymnasium window at the school. Somebody saw my brother do it, and they knew it was him because he was the only albino on the reservation. He was the only towhead on the entire reservation, just mayonnaise white with white hair and blue eyes. So you see him throwing a rock, it has to be him, okay? There were Chippewa Indians that were as light complected as I was, but I had dark hair. When I had hair, I had dark hair. But he's the blue-eyed blonde, and he chucks a rock through a window, and it got back to my dad. Mr. Waldrip, your son was seen about a half an hour ago throwing a rock through the gymnasium window. What would you like us to do? He called up the chief of police. I said, I want you to send a unit around to my house and place my son into custody. I want you to arrest him. I want you to take him to the police station. I want you to scare the life out of him. You know? Did it take? No, it didn't take. Anybody else? You find yourself up against someone with an unassailable position of real authority, and you're just like this. Really? Okay. I found myself, I was a kid who grew up, like I met Walter Cronkite when I was 10 years old. I met Wilbur Mills, chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee. Al Ullman, later chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee, a couple of senators, and all that kind of stuff growing up. So these guys really didn't impress me. But I found myself at the Air Force Academy standing in front of General Robin Olds. Very impressive guy, two-time All-American football player at West Point. He became an ace fighter pilot in World War II. The very first mission he flew, he shot down 5 planes. He didn't shoot down any planes in Korea because he married a Hollywood actress, and they were so concerned that her husband not be harmed that they wouldn't let him go to Korea and fight. Then he went to Vietnam and flew out of Thailand and got 4 kills, and then they told him, yeah, if you become an ace in Vietnam, we're going to rotate you back home, give you a medal, and we'll brag on you. And so from that moment on, he had no recorded kills. That's not to say he didn't have any kills. He had no recorded kills because he didn't want it. So he was a warrior, okay? And I found myself standing in front of him at attention while he spoke to me in a low whispering voice that wielded great authority, okay? And I'm not sure that we have any idea what that's like anymore. We just no longer live in a culture where there is, where there's that kind of respect for authority. Maybe in a couple of branches of the service there might be, but so when I talk to you about people who are making an appeal to someone who had an unassailable position of unquestioned authority, most Americans have no concept of what that would be like. None. Because you have never been in a situation in your life where you might not, if properly motivated, mouth off. These guys, you don't do that to. You would never do that to these guys, okay? As well, the relationship between those making the appeal and the ones being appealed to could in no way be considered an appeal being made to one's peer. You can have a private in the Army standing in front of a four-star general, and despite the rank differential, he's a citizen of the United States and you're a citizen of the United States, and at some level there's parity in our culture, okay? That parity hasn't existed in most cultures down through history, but it exists in our culture, and it makes it so that we kind of don't understand some of these things. These people in the Bible were not making appeals to anyone who would be to them a peer, an equal in any way. They are down here, and the person that they are appealing to is way, 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 way up there. Socially, economically, authoritatively, and all that kind of stuff. There was no equality existing between Joseph and Potiphar. There was no equality that existed between the Moabitess named Ruth and Boaz. There was no equality that existed between Abigail and David. There was no equality that existed between Bathsheba and her husband, King David. There was no equality and parity that existed between Esther and King Ahasuerus. In the eyes of God, yes, but not in the eyes of men. Or between Daniel and the prince of the eunuchs. Or between Nehemiah and King Artaxerxes. Remember, when Nehemiah, the cupbearer to the king, recognized that when the king detected in his countenance unpleasantness, at that moment his life was on the line. You don't come into the presence of the king without being all happy. Doesn't matter what's going on at home. Doesn't matter what's going on elsewhere. Why? Because these guys don't tolerate people who are not so thrilled to be in the same room as them that they're all happy just to be there and to be alive. And so when they notice that you're not happy, and he asks, so what's your problem? Your life is on the line. You are this far away from dying, and quickly. So, understand that relationship exists in every single one of these examples that I've rehearsed to you about a person making an appeal to another person. But not with Jezebel. Not her. For a number of reasons. For one thing, when Jezebel married King Ahab and became his queen, understand she was a princess in her home country. She was the daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Zidonians, which was the big Phoenician city-state, okay? Most usually, however, even someone with her kind of noble bloodline would hardly provide a woman with anything like equal standing with her husband. Her birth in no way provided her with the standing of someone like, say, the Queen of Sheba. Okay? Now, there was an unusual woman. That woman would be worth a time of study and reflection by almost anybody. What explains Jezebel's relationship with Ahab was not her lineage, not her station, because relative to him, she didn't have a station, okay? What explains her relationship to her husband, the king of Israel, was his weakness coupled with her boldness, okay? The dynamic between the two of them is like a precursor to a 21st century marriage between two people. On one hand, a belligerent feminist female who conducts herself more like a mother to the man she's married to, and a beta male that is a very weak and very impotent guy who is so much more like his wife's child than like his wife's husband. Now let me illustrate. Take your Bible, if you would, and turn to 1 Kings chapter 21. 1 Kings chapter 21. King Ahab's neighbor in Samaria was a man, and a subject of his, by the way, was a man named Naboth. Naboth was the hereditary owner of a family vineyard that King Ahab wanted to purchase. Okay, he wanted it. He saw what somebody else owned and he wanted it for himself. That's called covetousness, right? It's a violation of one of the 10 Commandments, right? But he wanted it. When Naboth refused to sell his vineyard to the king, I mean, he did not want to cut loose from a piece of property that, according to the law of Moses, was supposed to remain in his family in perpetuity. So he didn't feel like he had the right to sell it, okay? Maybe lease it, and then in the year of Jubilee, every 50 years, it would come back to his family, something like that perhaps, but not what King Ahab had in mind. So when Naboth refused to sell his vineyard to the king, Ahab pouted. Read along with me and see if you come to the same conclusion that I do, beginning with 1 Kings chapter 21, verse 1. And it came to pass after these things that Naboth the Jezreelite had a vineyard which was in Jezreel, hard by the palace of Ahab, king of Samaria. It was his next door neighbor, in other words. And Ahab spake unto Naboth, saying, Give me thy vineyard, that I may have it for a garden of herbs, because it is near unto my house, and I will give thee for it a better vineyard than it. Or if it seem good to thee, I will give thee the worth of it in money. In other words, I'll make you a deal you can't refuse. And Naboth said to Ahab, The Lord forbid it me, that I should give the inheritance of my fathers unto thee. And Ahab came into his house heavy and displeased, because of the word which Naboth the Jezreelite had spoken unto him. For he had said, I will not give thee the inheritance of my fathers. And he laid him down upon his bed and turned away his face and would eat no bread. The only thing he didn't do was hold his breath until he turned blue. Would anybody dispute that what we have described here is a grown man pouting? A grown man pouting. Because I'm not getting my way. He's not going to let me have what I want. And he was raised to get everything he wanted. Oh, dear ladies, don't ever marry a guy who always gets what he wants. Because if he always gets what he wants, what's going to happen to you when you don't always give him what he wants? He's going to pout. That is, if he doesn't get violent, he's going to pout. When Jezebel realized that her childish husband was doing this, acting like the evil mother figure that she was, she plotted to arrange Naboth's murder, thereby solving her pathetic husband's problem. That's what you want, is you want a wife that goes around solving her husband's problems for him. Boy, isn't that a healthy marriage? Isn't that a great relationship where the mature female in the relationship takes care of the problems that are faced by the immature guy? Boy, isn't that healthy. Okay. By the way, guys, if you ever get married and your wife offers to do something like that for you, beg her, honey, please don't do that. I remember years ago, maybe 20 years ago, here in Monrovia, there was a guy ran for city council. He was a twerp. He was a twerp. Little bitty guy, mousy guy, puny little personality. He was nasty, arrogant, conceited. And I don't have anything to do with the city council. I don't have anything to do with the city. I don't like to wash my hands every 5 minutes. And you get filthy and unclean when you deal with government types, and I just feel bad. So I didn't have anything to do with him. Well, anyway, the guy approached me in public and made a comment that was disparaging to the gospel and disparaging to the ministry of this church. And I said, I don't think that's an appropriate comment. Feisty little guy looks up at me. And he starts coming at me with these words. And I said, well, two things, sir. Number one, you flat do not know what you're talking about. And number two, those kind of comments are not your call. 30 minutes later, I get an irate phone call from guess who? The missus.
Who do you think you are talking to my husband like that?
And I said, apparently I'm talking to a child whose mommy has to clean up his problems. Boy, did she go off on me. And I told her, I said, lady, I'm not impressed by you. I'm not impressed by your husband. I'm not impressed by any man who sits down and lets his wife solve his problems for him. We are done. So guys, you don't let your wife solve your problems like that, okay? So, let's begin reading from verse 5 of 1 Kings chapter 21. But Jezebel, his wife, came to him and said unto him, Why is thy spirit so sad that thou eatest no bread? And he said unto her, Because I spake unto Naboth the Jezreelite, and said unto him, Give me thy vineyard for money, or else, if it please thee, I will give thee another vineyard for it. And he answered, I will not give thee my vineyard. And Jezebel, his wife, said unto him, Dost thou now govern the kingdom of Israel? Arise and eat bread, and let thine heart be merry. I will give thee. I'm going to solve your problem for you. Okay, okay, Jezebel. I will give thee the vineyard of Naboth the Jezreelite. So she wrote letters in Ahab's name and sealed them with his seal. Boy, it just sounds like 20th century politics, Washington, D.C. Speaking on behalf of her weak, wimpy husband. And sent the letters unto the elders and to the nobles that were in his city, dwelling with Naboth. And she wrote in the letters, saying, Proclaim a fast, and set Naboth on high among the people, and set 2 men, sons of Belial, before him to bear witness against him. In other words, she's setting him up. She's setting him up. She's going to bring him down. Saying, Thou didst blaspheme God and the king. Now, nowadays it would say, you were overheard talking to Russians. Thou didst blaspheme God and the king, and then carry him out and stone him that he may die. And the men of the city, even the elders and the nobles who were the inhabitants of the city, did as Jezebel had said unto them. And as it was written in the letters which she had sent unto them, they proclaimed a fast and set Naboth on high among the people. And there came in 2 men, children of Belial. And the Revised Version says that one of these guys was named John Podesta. But that's the Waldrip Revised Version. And sat before him, and the men of Belial witnessed against him, even against Naboth, in the presence of the people, saying, Naboth did blaspheme God and the king. Then they carried him forth out of the city, and stoned him with stones that he died. Then they sent to Jezebel, saying, Naboth is stoned and is dead. And it came to pass, when Jezebel heard that Naboth was stoned and was dead, that Jezebel said to Ahab, Arise, take possession of the vineyard of Naboth the Jezreelite, which he refused to give thee for money, for Naboth is not alive but dead. And it came to pass, when Ahab heard that Naboth was dead, that Ahab rose up to go down to the vineyard of Naboth the Jezreelite to take possession of it. That is the earliest example that I can find in the Bible of eminent domain foreclosure. And by the way, this is characteristic of Jezebel's relationship with this guy she's married to. There is nothing about their marriage dynamic suggesting that she had any concern, real concern, for either his position as her husband and the nation's king, or his long-term welfare. She did not appeal to Ahab. She was the leader in that relationship, and a damnably wicked woman to boot, as evidenced by the way her nefarious example is characterized centuries later in Revelation chapter 2, verse 20, where we read, Notwithstanding, this is the Lord Jesus Christ speaking about 800 years later, maybe 900 years later. Notwithstanding, I have a few things against thee, because thou sufferest that woman Jezebel. Now, it's not the same woman that was married to King Ahab, but it was the same kind of woman, which calleth herself a prophetess, to teach and to seduce my servants to commit fornication and to eat things sacrificed unto idols. Wow. So we don't have an isolated case of one woman acting like this with one man. There's a pattern. And the Lord Jesus Christ spoke directly and specifically to that pattern of behavior in that particular congregation centuries later. So how might we characterize a Jezebel type of woman's marital issues? Hypothetically, there may be two ways of considering a woman whose bossiness results in a complete disregard for her husband's position and long-term welfare. See, what do you mean by that, Pastor? I'm saying that every single thing a woman does with respect to her husband, she needs to take into consideration how that will be perceived and how that will be received by his peers, by the men that know your husband, and by the men whose opinions your husband values. Wow, there's not a lot of women do that anymore. Reminds me of my first pastorate. I've told this to you before, but it's so good. It's so good. We would have a work day on Saturday mornings every once in a while. And we'd get a group of guys coming. Mike DiGiovanna would come when he wasn't replacing the tile in his bathroom, which is like every 4 months. Mike Orlicki would come. Art Cato would come. A teenager named Manuel Luna would come. And Manuel was about 16 years of age, and he was a wonderful mimic. My goodness, the guy was a great mimic. So we had a guy named John who would come, and he would show up. We'd have our work party about 9 o'clock, Mike? About 9 o'clock. Do a few things, horse around. Sometimes, have carne asada barbecue after that. But this guy would show up. This is way before cell phones. Way before cell phones. This guy would show up. You start counting the minutes. Then the church phone would ring. And when the church phone would ring, all the guys in the church, nice guys, and we liked the guy. But this is what would happen. The phone would ring and we'd all kind of like, each guy's making eye contact with each other guy. I mean, there's a lot of communication, but no words are spoken. Okay? We knew who was on the other end of that phone. And I would go, I was the pastor, I'd go answer the phone. And there would be a harried and energetic and feverish and fervent female on the phone. Can I talk to John? And I would put the phone down. And I would come out. Guys were doing something. And I would say, your wife. And he would walk over into my office and pick up the phone. And we could hear the shrieking on the phone. John, what's going on? And it was always those same words. John, what's going on? And Mike, did you ever hear it any other way? It was always that. And Tony knows. Well, Manuel Luna was a great kid. I have no idea whatever happened to him. I have no idea whether he ended up being a coyote or a college professor, but he had a wonderful personality. But he was a great mimic, and as John was walking to the phone, Manuel would, John, what's going on? John, what's going on? So this is a 16-year-old guy mimicking a 35-year-old gutless wonder. Okay? And this woman, look, I don't care what the emergency is. The house could be on fire. Okay. So the house is on fire. Okay, armed robbers come to hold up the place. Okay, so armed robbers come to hold up the place. So what? More important than the house burning down, more important than armed robbers holding up the place, is your husband's reputation with his friends. She didn't care. The nice euphemism that we use is emasculation. Doctors would use a different term. My grandfather, who used to slaughter hogs, would use an entirely different term altogether. And do you hear me, Isaiah? Yeah. Anyway, she had no regard for him. He was the king, but she had no regard for his reputation. She had no regard for his standing. This kind of woman is on a power trip and will use every physical and emotional trick in her arsenal to manipulate, intimidate, deceive, and otherwise bully their men to get their way. And it doesn't start when they get married. Oh, it starts when they're 13 years old, 14 years old, 15 years old. When that kind of a girl gets her first boyfriend, who she starts bossing around and ordering around and disputing with him in public, and he'll say something and she'll disagree with him, and she'll suggest this and she'll dispute that in front of his friends. Jezebel in the making. I think we had an example of that here not too long ago. Anything to get her way. Never mind that it isn't God's will. Never mind that it hardens and sears the conscience of the woman who's doing it. It is self-destructive behavior by the person who does it. She's harming herself more than she's hurting anybody else. And never mind that it sucks the vitality and masculinity from a man's soul. That is, if he doesn't have very much. If he has much, he's not going to put up with that nonsense. Never mind that boys are crushed under the cruel obstinacy of that kind of a mother, or that kind of a grandmother, or that kind of a sister, or a wife who takes this approach with boys, with men. The fragile nature of the men in her orbit are of no concern to her. This kind of Jezebel this is not the person who doesn't know any better. This is not the person who was raised in a situation where she had a bossy mother who dominated a weak father, and she simply doesn't know any other way of conducting herself in her marriage, which is the case in so many matriarchal marriages, matriarchal cultures. And it's the case with many women in our culture as a result of the feminism that has caused such cultural destruction in these United States. Couple this with profoundly weak men who live their lives in denial and who have no plan to fix the problems they live with, and you have a recipe for marital disaster and misery. Astonishing. The essential ingredient in this recipe is ignorance on the woman's part, pure and simple, cowardice on the man's part. So you've got one kind of Jezebel, she's just ignorant, she doesn't know any better. She just acts toward men the way she sees other women act toward men, the way she saw her mother act toward men, the way she saw her aunt act toward men. Okay, she doesn't know any better. And then there's the evil woman who just doesn't care. This one doesn't even think about it. This one has thought about it, is calculated, and she's doing it knowing what the result is, but she doesn't care. And those are the two kinds of Jezebels that exist in the human race. And so it would be inappropriate to consider anyone like that when she seeks to influence a man as making an appeal, because she doesn't ask any man. A Jezebel doesn't ask. A Jezebel fires up her D9 cat, gets it nice and warm, drops the blade down, and just pushes the throttle forward and just bulldozes everybody in front of her. Whether it be her husband, whether it be her sons, whether it be her brother, whether it be her dad, whether it be guys that she works with, she just bulldozes people in front of her. And now sometimes she does it because she doesn't know any better, but sometimes she does it because she's evil, wicked, mean, and nasty. And what she does is not called making an appeal. My preference is for a woman of courage. My preference is for a woman of wisdom. My preference is for a woman of intelligence. My preference is for a woman who's godly. Okay? My preference is for a woman who takes the long view for the benefit of everyone around her, whether they be men that she doesn't want to crush or destroy, whether it be the girls that she wants to set the proper example for. Those are the kind of women that I think the cause of Christ and every good church need. Do you have a question on Jezebel? Anyone? Say, Pastor, you really got it in for this woman. I do. Oh, I mean, and without apology. Oh, I think she's disastrous. She's a disaster for a culture. She's a disaster for a marriage. She's a disaster for children. She's a disaster for a church. Oh, this is a one-woman walking plague. And the tragedy is that you have parents who have this kind of a daughter, and they try to pretend that their daughter is kind of a nice, sweet thing, and she's nothing of the kind. She's a barracuda. You know? You say, well, how do you deal with somebody like that? That's not the purpose of our study. The purpose of our study is to learn how to make a biblical appeal. And so I'm going to leave Jezebel behind, and we're going to move on next week, Lord willing. Unless you have a question you'd like for me to address. I think a Jezebel can be dealt with. I really do. And I don't think it requires violence. I don't think it requires emotion. Now, the Jezebel she'll blow her stack. She'll scream and yell. rant and rave and have conniption fits and do all of that kind of stuff. Just, call 911, have her committed. When she calms down. I remember there was a guy actually at this church years ago who was married to a woman that was one of the bossiest and most irreverent and crushing women I've ever known. And I tangled with her on a number of occasions. I didn't pick a fight, but I knew there would be times that she would confront me, and it always took a minimum of 3 hours. 2.5 hours for her to go hormonal on me, and I'm not being a sexist. Men get hormonal too. Once these hormones get injected into the bloodstream, you go completely biological. You're not rational. You're not thinking. You're just squirting hormones. All the adrenal glands are just pumping away, and you're going and you got to get that out of your system. Fine, it usually takes a couple of hours. With her, it would talk about, I'm sure she had abnormally large adrenal glands. Wouldn't you think, Mike? Huge adrenal glands. Wouldn't you think, Tony? Really, really large adrenal glands. Okay? Because it'd take 2.5 hours. And after 2.5 hours, and I'm sitting there, and I never raised my voice to her, not one time ever. I don't do that. And she was just doing this, and then eventually she would run out of steam. And then I would start asking her questions. So, well, what does Paul say in this passage? And then she would, because she knew her Bible well, she just didn't do her Bible well. And then her husband would come to me, and he would. And here's the problem. Because he was a sniveling coward, I'm of the opinion that he could have dealt with the situation rather easily, and I think she would have been very happy with it in the long run. You say, well, what do you mean? He would come home from work and she would start screaming at him to cower him. My recommendation is she does that because you allow people to do that to you. Nobody does that to me. Nobody does that to me. Now, before I was a Christian, the reason nobody would do that to me is I'd punch him out. After I became a Christian, the reason nobody would do that to me is I'd turn around and walk away. I am not going to allow people to talk to me that way. No. And I told him, I said, look, she starts screaming and yelling at you, just take the keys to the car, get up and go someplace. I said, you don't have to argue with her. You don't have to yell at her. You don't have to be mean to her. I think you should be kind. I think you should be considerate. I think you should be gentle. But you should not allow her to scream and yell at you. He said, well, she orders me around like she's a general and I'm a buck private. I said, she's got it backwards. I said, you ought to never do what she orders you to do. Not one time ever in your life from this point forward. Don't you ever do what she orders you to do. But you should kill yourself trying to do what she very nicely asks you to do. If it's a reasonable request, kill yourself giving her what she asks for. Be kind to her, be gentle, be tender, be sweet, treat her with respect and courtesy and love, but be absolutely non-responsive when she starts acting like a Jezebel. You say, well, what do you think will happen? It may take a day, it may take a week, it may take a month, it may take a year, but it's not going to continue. She's not going to keep doing that. I promise you, the reason people do that is because for them it works. The only way to get people to not do it is to be the person in her life who makes sure that don't work anymore here. don't have to yell. You don't have to raise your voice. You don't have to express displeasure. You don't have to do any of that stuff. Except stop rewarding sinful behavior. Stop rewarding sinful behavior. Now understand, your wife is not your child. I know one guy that said, okay, let's have the keys to the car. And he told me that. I said, what? He said, well, what's wrong? I said, she's not your kid. You have no right to tell her what to do. You have absolutely no right to tell her what to do. She's an adult. Well, I grounded her. I said, you don't have any right to do that. Who do you think you are? But neither does she have the right to tell you what to do. You see, marriage is between two equals. There's parity there, right? There should be cooperation. Amen? I don't think a husband should boss his wife around. I don't think a wife should boss her husband around. If a wife bosses her husband around, she's a Jezebel. If a husband bosses his wife around, he's a bully. And they're both wrong. You see, are there ways to deal with it? I believe that there are ways to deal with it. Okay? I believe that there are ways to deal with it. And I don't think you have to compromise your Christianity at all. I don't think you have to forsake your gentlemanliness at all. I don't think you have to violate your vow to never punch out a female who doesn't try to punch you out first. I think you could be a very, very, very nice guy. A very, very, very nice guy who simply, that doesn't work with me. That just simply doesn't work with me. So what do you want to talk about now? Okay. I think civil discourse is wonderful, don't you? I think we should be civil with each other. Okay? Do I sound like a mean, irresponsible guy here? Do I sound like an abusive husband? No, be a nice guy. Be a nice guy. And be a nice wife. Be a nice wife. Amen? No one has any questions on Jezebel? Okay. Next week, Lord willing, we're going to begin